Hey, it's Soul. This is a video about a familiar topic. The randomness in the World of Warcraft, and especially Legion, its latest expansion, has set the course for complaints, critical feedback, bitching, maybe. But now we're at a point where players will have realized a complete expansion with a controversial system that is so much more than just Titan forging. It's much more complicated than just saying RNG, RNG, RNG until listeners go deaf, and it's a lot more nuanced. What we experience as players now has been in the making for quite some time. This is the Legion paradigm, and I'm going to try and understand why WoW's past led to our present. I'll take you with me, and let's try not to get lost. Usual disclaimer, I don't know jack shit about game design, I just play it off and hope for the best. Here's a short story about a sword I wanted. It was called the Red Sword of Courage. It was during the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. It dropped from the last boss of Utgard Pinnacle. Every day I would run a heroic to bring this boss down and hope for that weapon. As I repped up with the factions around me, as I fiddled with alts and got them started on their own Northrend campaign, as I mastered that instance and come to know it like the back of my hand, I farmed for the sword. It would be 58 runs until I got it. I wouldn't return again until well into the expansion with the looking for dungeon system activated, and randomly, I returned to my private hell. So there's a story to that weapon, just one story that ends with, I got it. Sometimes it's followed with an epilogue like, oh, it dropped like half the time afterwards, go figure. I'm sure players such as yourself have your own story to share about some weapon, some trinket or mount, or whatever random drop they hoped for. But those kinds of stories are ancient history. Today in World of Warcraft Legion, the idea of that single story no longer applies. There are systems in place that make those Red Swords of Courage stories more like a series, not to just get it, but the best version of it. The Legion paradigm sums up to acquiring a massive number of items through all of WoW's existing activities, and the hope that at the top of that pile is the ideal version of that thing you want. Very different from back in the day, but this didn't happen overnight. Back then it was a hard-fought battle to get those things you wanted. Oftentimes those coveted items came from raiding, which was a more exclusive activity. Loot was still random of course, but it was handled by people, and people created their own systems of loot distribution. DKP, Loot Council, EPGP, Suicide Kings, and many other variations of all these that were the foundation of both a team's organization and a whole lot of drama. Who among the 40 members was going to get the 2 or 3 pieces of loot? The answers were what built those early versions of prestige. If you had an epic piece of gear, you showed that off. If you had a complete set, well, you lorded over your lesser counterparts atop the tallest mailbox. Here is a small problem though. Thanks to such a low distribution of items, as time passed, it became harder and harder for players who fell behind to catch up. The strongest were taken to progression runs, and those who went to these runs got the gear. So, players who wanted to raid couldn't because they didn't have the gear. And they didn't have gear because they weren't invited to raids. This didn't go unnoticed by Blizzard. So time passed and numerous systems of guaranteed rewards began to surface for the sake of preventing this very thing. Valor, justice, honor points, reputation, crafting. It wasn't always raid gear, but it's close enough. It kept players caught up in the event they were benched. It kept the pool of potential recruits large because at least there were opportunities to gear up outside of raids. It made alt management a reasonable venture, despite any criticism you might hear about alt unfriendliness today. The stories and drama persisted though. The awesome drops were still exclusive and hard to obtain. And the idea of best in slot began to take root, not just for the elite of the elite, but for the regular players who hear whispers of what the best players fought for. The internet itself also matured and played a heavy influence. The accessibility of information, or what I call the industry of WoW, galvanized the curious and secured the budding mentality of min-maxing at every player level. Icy Veins, Discord channels, Ask Mr. Robot, simulations, Warcraft logs, YouTubers, and streamers. With a culture like this, where help and information are at our fingertips, one of the pillars that held up the value of being in a guild began to erode. A big part of being in a guild, or any community, is helping one another, answering questions, giving advice, teaming up with the like-minded. When Google is available 24 hours a day and directs players to information so quickly, it's no wonder when questions are asked publicly, the usual answer isn't really an answer, but just to go look it up on Google or Wowhead. So armed with the knowledge of what to obtain and the suggestions of the game's most vocal players, Guilds became secondary, with the power to pug or just go off on your own, and Blizzard strengthened this desire. Players rightfully critique that the stagnation of WoW's community probably came with cross-realm zones and the raid finder difficulty compromising the feeling of raiding. But I'd argue that the conveniences of grouping has more or less led to independence from guilds and permanent groups altogether. But maybe that's just a sign of the times. So how is Blizzard to respond to a community of millions with the answers a few clicks away, and the tools to fulfill basic group needs faster than ever before? We've come to a point where the value of gear felt binary, even if that wasn't true. It wasn't just about best in slot anymore, but the appearance between viable and unviable. What you need versus garbage gear. A website could tell a player what their best gear was, where to get it, and the relative drop percentage rate, while telling you, mathematically, why everything else isn't worth farming for. A player's ideal character build was cast in bronze with a sprinkle of reforging. And some players may have felt that if their character didn't fit that mold, there was no satisfaction to be found. Not according to what a website tells them, at least. Now, before I move on, let me just point out that I'm speaking in absolutes for simplicity's sake. Not everyone feels this way to any certain degree, alright? Alright, let's continue. By the time the Mist Pandaria expansion came along, Blizzard appeared tired of the obvious path to wish fulfillment. Funny enough, this started with giving players a chance at more loot. In came bonus rolls. On the other end came the idea of disrupting the best in slot mentality with Thunderforged gear, to be later called Warforged. And so came the notion that an item could be the best, unless it was Warforged. Then it was like the super best. More chances at loot meant more chances at Warforged, meant more reasons to play, meant more chances for further wins. And disappointment. And Blizzard liked it, pushing it through the Warlords of Draenor expansion along with the idea of randomized crafted gear. The idea of giving players more chances was even further embraced. Let's give players more loot. In came the bi-weekly raid cache, the random weekly bonus events. And then came Legion, and all that we've come to be familiar with. Emissary chests, Order Hall mission quests, Mythic Keystone dungeons, and the weekly cache. These systems and all that came before it are now wrapped with Titan forging to nearly destroy the ideas of where to get the best items and, oddly enough, when. Best in slot still exists within certain ranges and probabilities, but the time frame of any given patch just doesn't allow the same feeling of completion or fulfillment as before. Player-run loot systems still exist. Loot envy continues, only now players can be jealous of other players who have better versions of a wanted item. There's still of course that hurdle of getting said item in the first place. The stories still exist, but there are as many endings as there can be within item level ranges. The goals of this mandate, the Legion paradigm, its build-up, and other small things I didn't mention include giving players even more opportunities for nice things, to lessen the dependence on best in slot lists. And because Titan forging is tied to nearly all drops, all content has a relevance greater than zero. For some, the real estate of Legion is incredibly large, with many things to do, and the possibility for great drops to appear makes them enticing to do. For others, it's a prison of probability, one that isn't mitigated by a predictable consolation prize like artifact power. For others still, nothing's changed, and these players will still only do what is most relevant to them, and won't give Legion any more time than they did in any previous expansion. Unfortunately, some groups are more vocal than others, and it has little to do with the size of the group. It's clear to me at least, that the WoW team wanted to give players more freedom to participate, or to not. But for the sake of keeping players engaged, does it disenfranchise players who no longer have that single epic story to tell? Maybe Blizzard, in good intention, didn't want those stories to be written once. Maybe it was a mistake. Share your thoughts and stay breezy.